Hi, everyone. Welcome to the Center for Innovation in Campus Mental Health webinar series. We're just going to take a few minutes for attendees to start rolling in before we get started. So in about 1 or 2 minutes. Okay, thank you all for waiting and thanks for joining us today. The topic for today is developing a campus early alert system. So just a couple of things before we get started. All participants are on mute while we're on the call, so you're on listen-only mode. We will be taking questions at the end of the webinar, so feel free to type in your questions using the question function on the menu, and we'll start taking them up around 1:50. The webinar is being recorded and will be made available on our website. Also, if you look under the handouts function on the menu, you should be able to download a PDF of the presentation today. And this will also be made available on our website, so don't worry. We do have a short survey at the end of the webinar, so please take a few minutes to complete it as the feedback is really valuable to us. So I'm just going to introduce myself to those of you who don't know me. My name is Perling Ng. I am the Research and Knowledge Exchange Coordinator for the Center. And we are joined here today by Roxanne Ross and Shermin Murji. Thank you all for joining us today. So I'm just going to read a brief introduction for the both of them. Shermin is the administrator of the Thrive Priority Support Network at the University of Calgary's Early Alert Program. She is a doctoral candidate pursuing a doctorate in higher education. In various roles in Canadian and American post-secondary institutions, she has coordinated peer education programs, health education and prevention programs, as well as assessment and evaluation practices. Roxanne Ross is the director of the Student Success Center at the University of Calgary. Her portfolio includes centralized advising and academic support programs, writing, and mathematics tutoring. She was involved in the development and implementation of the Thrive Priority Support Network, which is the University of Calgary's Early Alert program, and launched formally in the fall of 2016. Okay, I'm going to turn it over to you guys now.
Okay, thanks so much, Perlin, and thank you everybody for joining us. We're actually going to just kind of focus on our slides here. Okay, so we're really pleased to be able to share best practices, and hopefully in the last few minutes we'll have an opportunity to hear questions and comments. We've been working on this project for a number of years, and really, as Perlin mentioned, we launched formally in fall 2016, and we're still, although we're really proud of where we are at with the program and happy to share our steps, we're still working on further developing the project. So for this session, we're going to be covering looking at common challenges for student help seeking, and we'll talk about that a bit more. We're going to be framing our approach to early alert in the kind of literature around early alert and proactive advising approaches in that sort of general framework. We'll talk about some of the structural and important considerations around stakeholders that are involved in implementing an early alert system. And then we also have some guiding questions that you might use in the process of developing your own practice as well. So just to kind of give you a quick overview of what we're going to be speaking about, I mentioned that we're going to be talking about early alert. We'll talk about the challenges of connecting with students. I think whether in the sort of mental health arena of student affairs or in the academic arena of student affairs, we certainly struggle with connecting with students at the right time and seeing students reach out to us that we design programming for a particular group of students and maybe they don't come always to reach out. So we'll talk about that. We're going to focus heavily on the University of Calgary model and our development process, where we are now, and as I mentioned, some planning questions for your own early alert approach.
So before we jump into what an early alert program is, especially at the University of Calgary, we want to just first start to just address that students do leave college and university before they complete their degree. And this isn't always for bad reasons. We're framing this conversation as a retention initiative, but we recognize, especially talking to many of you who already are working in the field, that mental health is a reason that many of our students are struggling and considering taking a break or not completing university, and that's not always a bad thing. So there are many reasons why students choose to leave. Some of the ones that we have found, and based on research as well. A lot of this is based on the American student engagement research, but we know that students that are not engaged on campus, that don't feel connected or don't feel like a sense of belonging to the campus or the community, tend to leave more frequently than students that have more of a affiliation with their institution. Sometimes university is just not the right fit. Post-secondary might not be what the student is best suited for, or at that time it might not be the right time for them. A lot of times we're seeing students that are just not in the right program. So if they're finding they're in an engineering program and they realize, you know what, trades is better for me, and that's not what the institution offers, they might be going elsewhere to get that education. We recognize, especially with the different populations that we're serving, that sometimes there's a lot of financial limitations as well as family pressure or commitments. A lot of times, especially it's more prevalent, I think, in the US than Canada, but there's sometimes it's just a lack of academic preparation. A lot of times students do not know what they're getting into when they get to university, and the academic workload can be a little bit overwhelming and contribute to burnout. The other part of it, and this is something Roxanne and I talk about often, which we'll also talk about during our outcomes, is if the individual is part of a vulnerable or at-risk group, they might actually be more inclined to have difficulties that they're challenged with that make them a little bit more disadvantaged when it comes to being successful at post-secondary. And obviously the last one that we're really going to talk about today are the stress, burnout, health issues, which obviously encompasses mental health as a big part of that. So here's some key definitions. I have to give a shout out to Sarah Root at Mount Royal University. She used these ones in a presentation recently, and we felt that these ones were great for providing the context. So the three key terms we're probably going to use quite a bit that we just want to make sure we're all on the same page are retention, attrition, and at-risk students. So when you look at retention, obviously we're hoping that our students continue to be enrolled at the same institution, and that is also a key priority for many institutions across Canada. When we look at attrition, it's the students that are not continuing. So when we say our attrition rate is the amount of students, or the percentage of students that are not continuing from one year to the next. And then when we mention at-risk students, there are many groups of students or in which they have a higher chance of not being successful at university. And some of these that we've talked about include first generation, commuter students, mature students, Indigenous students. There's many different at-risk populations, and so recognizing that students might have that as well to overcome it is an important note.
Okay, so thinking about early alert generally as an outreach, as Sherman mentioned, the literature grows and grows on some of the challenges for students around retention, and so there has been a huge growth also in the support services that have been developed. From American institutions, really early alert started to originate out of the recognition that in spite of the significant growth and development of student support services, retention rates were remaining fairly unchanged. So early alert is really a reframing of the support question. So we move away from the notion of do we have the right resources in place to how do we connect the right students to the right resources. And the recognition also around the kind of focus on mental health and well-being, and the needs of those students in Canadian institutions in particular, I think have started to really frame early alert initiatives as well. And that's been a big part of our focus. In fact, our original program was funded by the provincial funding, the Alberta Provincial Mental Health Funding for mental health and addiction. And so we were able to kind of access a small part of this funding to begin our early alert program. So components of early alert are pretty simple. We're really looking at proactive outreach. So we're trying to identify students in need and connect those students to resources. I think that the notion of being proactive as service providers is really the change. It's not assuming that students know what the resources are, that students can necessarily find the resources or know when to connect with them at the appropriate time, but taking on some of that responsibility as resource providers. Again, really this relies on proactive advising, so it means that it's advisor directed. We have an understanding of what retention challenges are. We anticipate what those challenges are and try to intervene with students early in a problem. And then there's efforts to kind of motivate students to engage in the resources that are available. So there are many ways to identify students. There are many different frameworks for early alert. Certainly when we started our foray into designing our early alert program for the University of Calgary, we looked at a lot of ready-made identification programming, and we saw that there's a really wide range on what people collect. So academic factors, the notion of collecting students' in-course progress, their grades as they are progressing within a particular course, has been a fairly long-standing tradition in early alert. And for many reasons, institutional factors, this is the area that we have chosen to focus on, and we'll explain that a bit more in a minute. They're also looking at behavioral factors, so engagement. We know that if students are connected to the university, they have a sense of belonging, they're part of clubs and programs, they tend to be better retained and they tend to be more successful. The opposite, if there's a lack of engagement there, that the opposite is true. Are they attending? Do they have issues with financial aid applications? Are they getting their deadlines in time? And those sorts of behavioral factors. And then also non-cognitive factors. So these tend to be more predictive modeling, so having students complete surveys at the beginning that look at their motivations and goal orientation for attending university, their self-efficacy, so do they believe that they will be successful? Also looking at resilience, personal resilience, and those factors. And lastly, demographic factors are often included in this. So if it's a particular population, as Shermin was mentioning, that may be more at risk, or that we know statistically is more at risk, those factors might be captured. We don't typically, I mean, we'll talk a little bit more about non-cognitive factors. In our program currently, we don't look at those. Part of our decision not to look at those in the design of our program was more in a practical sense, in the sense that if you have limited resources, we want to be reaching out to students at a time when we think they're most likely to take up those resources, particularly because our program is designed as a one-on-one support program. And so we tended to look at academic factors, knowing that those were superficial indicators of mental health or other issues going on for students, but that in a moment of academic decline, a student might be more likely to pick up on the academic support that was being offered. Some of the issues that we see in early alert students. So many of these you may see if we kind of link back to retention challenges that Shermin already mentioned. So financial, housing, roommate issues, boyfriend, girlfriend, partner breakups, physical and mental health. Sometimes it has to do with immigration status, visa, student visa, legal issues, etc. Loss of motivation or not necessarily in the right program. Certainly personal loss with family members or friends. And then lastly, probably our largest population of students that we see really focuses on transition. So those students who are in their first year and are struggling to just to really adapt their academic skills or to culturally adapt to a new setting. And so again, as I mentioned, early alert is about framing how do we connect students to resources. And part of the initial development of an early alert program is to really explore what makes it so hard for students to connect early. I mentioned before, we probably have all, those of us that are student facing have probably all experienced issues where we wish a student had seen us sooner, or we wish that we sometimes are working with students who are wonderful to work with, but they're the very highly self-regulated learners who have great help-seeking skills and know that that helps their success. And so how do we reach out to these other populations of students who aren't accessing the programs who they're designed for? And so thinking about what the stigma that's involved in help seeking, the fact that it is really difficult and challenging for students to navigate the number of resources that exist on campus, and to know how those resources might help them, I think is also really key to keep in mind. And so we tried to really take into account the challenges that students have with help seeking in the particular university environment as we design this program.
So those were two of the questions that really guided, I think, the development and focus of the project. When we looked at the University of Calgary's experience, that's kind of where we're going to segue into. And one thing I didn't mention early on is you'll notice most of these slides have a little dinosaur or some animation on there. That is actually our branding for our program. So if you know University of Calgary, we have Rex the dinosaur as our mascot here. And so after doing some focus group and some surveying, we found that taking that very identifiable image and modifying it for our purpose actually connects really well with students. They understand, they connect with it, they know that it's a University of Calgary program, and it also makes it, I think, a little, it's branding always is a good thing when you're looking at doing some programming and program development, but I did want to mention that in case you're wondering why there's all these little animations and cartoons on our slides. So as I mentioned, we're going to segue into the University of Calgary perspective and approach of early alert. So what we really looked at is recognizing that in the Student Success Center, we serve students academically. It was very much an academic focus of the academic changes of their behavior. So what that meant is we were looking at the individual student and their own previous performance. It wasn't about comparing them to a comparison group that was similar in terms of demographics, including high school grades and such. It was saying, here's a student, let's recognize when they are shifting from their previous behavior. In that way, if a student is an A student and drops down to a B, they will be identified of being at risk as much as a student that's consistently at a D that starts dropping to failing. So part of that also, I wanted to mention, we've been throwing around retention, that retention is an issue across Canada, and I realized we didn't actually give you any statistics. So generally speaking, around Canada ranges between 57 to 64%. So that means about 65% of the students that are coming to university or college are actually graduating. And that is actually pretty abysmal when you think about it, but it's pretty consistent across Canada and the US. But obviously we recognize that if that many students, if 35% of our students are not completing, that's a huge population that we could be serving that we aren't currently. One of the other recognition that we had is that low attendance is actually the #1 indicator of students being at risk for attrition. So we recognize that not only is it a change in academic behavior, maybe a superficial indicator of something larger going on, but we also recognize that them not attending class also can be a huge piece of that, which is why faculty are such an integral role in what we do. So as Roxanne mentioned, ours is a very one-on-one focused program. So the idea is that we want to identify these students that are at risk as early as possible and support them one-on-one with an academic development specialist. So in the Student Success Center here at the U of C, we have academic development specialists that meet one-on-one with students to discuss whatever academic issues they're looking for. So a lot of times it's studying and learning skills like time management, transition issues, looking at how to read a textbook, how to take notes appropriately, a lot of those very tangible skills. And we know that having a student that is struggling, having some connection, or having an individual say, look, I'm here if you want to talk, is a very important touch point for them. As we identified earlier, that low engagement is a huge indicator of students not staying within the institution. So the idea is let's connect these individual students with academic development specialists to at least give them a contact if they're willing to chat with us and dig a little bit deeper of what's changed in their life and what's going on. But we really look at how can we develop learning strategies, especially that are self-regulated, for students once they identify what their issues that they're struggling the most are. Roxanne and I were talking yesterday about one of the key outcomes of what we want to do is refer our students onwards. So we know that the students that we meet, we're not going to serve them. We're not going to be able to help them with everything. We can help them with that academic specific aspect, but there's so many other concerns, and a lot of times they're mental health. A lot of times they're concerns that we're not properly trained or are not the right individuals to support them with. So we have a huge referral network, excuse me, that we support students with to send them for more information and more support. So this was what we ended up coming up with. This is a video, so if it doesn't show up, there's actually a link that I think Perlin is going to share that is also the video, so you can check it out on your own time as well, but hopefully you'll be able to see it and follow along.
Welcome to the University of Calgary, a place to spark your imagination, cheer on the dinos, and make new friends. University's great, except when it's not. Sometimes we face unexpected challenges, like getting sick or not getting that student loan you needed, or feeling overwhelmed. Just remember, there are services here to help. But how do you access those services, or even know what's available? Sometimes you may not even know you need help, especially when you're struggling. That's where we come in, with an email. We're the Student Success Center. We'll send you a message inviting you to come in and meet. And when you come in, we'll listen to what's happening and suggest ways to help. Our advisors are great at providing writing and learning support, academic advising, and so much more. If we can't help directly, we'll introduce you to someone who can.
But wait, how did you know I needed help?
Sometimes professors notice when you're not yourself. Late assignments, sleeping in class, or missing class altogether, and they can let us know. More often, your grades tell us. If your marks drop significantly across a number of courses compared to how you normally do, we take notice, like if your B's turn to D's. When you're new to the university and we don't have past grades to compare against, we get concerned if you have trouble passing. In the past, we only had final grades to indicate if you needed help. Now, as professors enter results throughout the semester, we're able to reach out to you earlier with the help you need right when you need it.
And if I don't want to participate?
You can reply to our email and say, no thanks, or even ignore it altogether. We may contact you once more if you don't respond, but really, the decision's all yours.
I'm not sure. I really don't want anyone to know I need help.
Don't worry. Everyone needs help from time to time. Besides, your professors won't know you're accessing help. They won't be able to see how you're doing in your other classes, and none of this will show up on your transcript, ever. So, if you receive our email, come and see us. We'd love to meet you. Of course, you're always welcome to stop in, even without an invitation.
Okay, hopefully that was easy for everyone to see. If not, please do follow up on the link. We're quite proud of our little dinosaur. The other thing maybe I'll just touch base on, coming back to the help-seeking discussion we were having a minute ago. We did try, I think, first of all, we tried to kind of normalize help-seeking in our messaging with things like we all need help sometimes. We tried to make the imagery very accessible to students, something that they would recognize, but also very friendly. Making the program non-mandatory was really key for us, and making sure that students were aware that it was separate from their academic record. These were all things that we recognized through our consultation with our student leaders and also with faculty, and with some of our surveying that we did. So Shermin is going to talk in more detail about the specifics of how we identify students, but I thought maybe I would give you a sense of the timeline and our process. Might be helpful for those of you that are in the kind of throes of developing your own systems. So we began with some funding in fall 2013, as I mentioned, from the Mental Health and Addictions funding. We hired a coordinator, established a working group that included faculty, student representatives, people from IT, also people from teaching and learning, because we weren't exactly sure what kind of system we would use, but we thought we might be using the learning management system, which is where we ended up. We sent our coordinator off to an early alert development conference in the United States, where early alert was very well developed. And then we started doing some commercial early alert software testing. One of the things that we noticed with the testing was that it didn't quite fit our environment for a number of reasons. most of the products were developed in the United States. They tended to be very inclusive in terms of the types of things that they were flagging students and identifying students on. Everything from engagement and engagement in programming to financial issues to breakups with or arguments with a roommate, and they tended to be fairly open in terms of how they were sharing, and we recognized right away that that sort of surveillance approach probably wasn't going to be something that worked for us. The other thing that we found around the academic indicators and faculty involvement is that they tend to be fairly labor intensive for faculty. So we would have these long forms where faculty would be expected to go through and check off each of their students who they thought were struggling, and immediately when we worked with faculty here, we have very large classes, particularly in first year at the University of Calgary. Faculty said there's no way that this will be happening for us. So we had to look at some other ways of doing it, and we had to look at ways that would include faculty but also provide some automation to the structure. So we started with, in winter 2014, with a small pilot with invited faculty, and we started really cultivating relationships with IT and also our privacy officer, because we wanted to make sure that we were respecting our own kind of legal circumstances, but making sure that we were respecting students' privacy. We revised the model in 2014. We started using D2L data. So again, Sherman's going to go into a bit more detail about how we do that. And our Cognos system is really what we call enterprise reporting. It looks at our grade data for all of the students. And so working with IT, we developed an in-house tool in spring and fall 2015 to start our identification process with students. In winter 2016, we launched those tools and we launched the branding of our little dinosaur. And in spring and summer 2016, we did some refinement of the algorithm. We also, within that time, we did some presentations to the provost and dean's council, and got approval to launch the program in fall of 2016. Also, one of the things we really wanted to do is make sure that we weren't just putting a program out there without understanding how it was operating. So we did use some of our funding to hire a research assistant to start collecting data. We did a lot of student surveying, particularly on attitudes and how they felt about this kind of outreach. We hired a few students to kind of serve as student ambassadors also to promote the program across campus to students.
So now that we've built it up and talked for so long about how we got here, let's tell you what we actually do. So like Roxanne mentioned, we have a learning management system. So what it does is it pulls together data from, as we mentioned, the individual's historic GPA history, which is in the administrative software PeopleSoft, as well as pulls in unofficial grades that currently sit in D2L. D2L is similar to Blackboard or Canvas or whichever online platform you're using at your institution. So what happens is we pull together this data, and using the tool that we've developed, we're able to identify students based on a zone. So generally speaking, students that are in zone 1 and 2 and 3 are really high at risk, and we reach out to them immediately. Students that might be between 9 and 15, it goes all the way up to 15, those students we don't reach out to as often. Part of our development, and as we're constantly kind of reflecting and we're trying to refine it as much as possible, is we want to ensure we're correctly identifying students. So we're currently dealing with some of the limitations, I would say, of D2L in terms of what faculty use. Currently, we're fortunate enough that we were able to use the default settings. So right now, if a faculty member just developed a D2L site, if they left the settings as default, whatever data they inputted in of students' grades would be captured in our system. If the faculty member, however, changes that and modifies the settings, then we won't be able to encompass that data and get a more holistic or comprehensive picture of the student. Recognizing that data is really important and we love the numbers, we also didn't want to lose that individual touch. So as we mentioned about attendance, or a student or a faculty recognizing there's been a change in student behavior, or they're not as engaged, they're not coming to class, they're consistently asking for extensions. We wanted to give faculty the opportunity to recognize that and to report that. So we've actually also developed a really quick, it takes 30 seconds to fill it out. Faculty are invited to fill in the students' ID, the university ID, as well as their name, and there's a checklist of different academic behaviors that might be exhibited by the student. So that is the things I mentioned, including asking for extensions, or a shift in the quality of work, or not attending, or if they do attend, really low participation. These kind of behaviors faculty and TAs can recognize and then report on that, and that actually contributes to identifying what the zone score for each student is. So each of these aspects play a huge part in ensuring that we identify students that are at risk accurately. Once I pull that data every week, once we look at that data, I then am able to kind of assign a certain number of cases to each academic development specialist here in the Student Success Center. We have about 5, and each of them will then reach out to the students that they've been assigned with a pretty standard email, but that is from their own personal email with their own name attached to it, to say, you know, we recognize that there's been a change in your behavior and we're here to support you, and to invite them in for a meeting. As Roxanne mentioned, it is completely voluntary, so if students ignore us, that is fine. We send them a follow-up a week later. If a student does not want to receive any information from us, they can always respond and let us know, and then we do add them to our Do Not Contact list. So the next 2 slides kind of talk about the data points. Oh, sorry, that was timed. The data points associated with how we identify a change in behavior. So looking at winter 2017, it's not a one individual course shift. We do look for multiple data points. So we ensure that here, for example, this student is exhibiting a drop in behavior across 3 courses. So that would, using our algorithm, identify them more at risk than a student who was maybe only having a shift in 2 classes. One of the struggles that we recognized early on was that first-year, first-term students, so brand new students, do not have previous grades in our administrative software. So there's nothing to compare themselves to. So what we focused on instead was recognizing that to get into the University of Calgary, sorry, I think we have some timing action happening here. To get into the university, they needed a certain level of grades. And so for first-year, first-term, if they were failing or on the cusp of failing, those are the students that we would identify and reach out to. And usually those conversations, as Roxanne mentioned, are a little bit more about transition and adjusting to university life rather than the academic side of it.
Okay, privacy. So privacy was, we really engaged our privacy officer right from the beginning, because we wanted to ensure, first of all, that we were really transparent with how we were using information, and that, again, it didn't, students didn't feel that we were surveilling them. We recognized that there was some sensitivity to being flagged and receiving an email saying that you might be struggling. So and the stigma involved in that. So we want to be really careful about how we went about that. Basically, because we're looking at grade, so there were a couple of things. So we started off with maybe a much broader umbrella when we looked at those identifiers, those ways of identifying students in early alert at the very beginning of the presentation. I mentioned, you know, there are many things that could be considered. We ended up narrowing our focus quite significantly to only academic factors, partially because institutionally that's our mandate. So student success in the Student Success Center, academic success and student retention is our mandate. So from a privacy perspective, we could collect this information under the Post-Secondary Learning Act. As long as we had a solid collection notice on the university website and that students received a clear message about what we were collecting and how we were collecting it and what we were using. Our advisors in the Student Success Center already have access to academic grade information, so the only real difference here was that we were using unreported grades, and we were clear to kind of make sure that our system that tracks that information is very separate from the academic record, so that there wasn't any issue in terms of students' privacy, or in terms of students being impacted by the collection of unreported grades that are not official grades. Faculty can put information, they can fill out as many forms and reports into the Thrive system, but they don't receive any information on what happens with students. That's purposeful so that students who may feel tentative about getting help if their faculty member is going to know about that don't have to feel worried about that. We make sure, you saw in our messaging, we make sure we're really clear that this information is confidential and that students can use the service without anyone knowing. I mentioned previously that we did quite a bit of surveying to kind of get a sense of how students felt about the way that we were doing this, and so One survey we did with 345 participants, we found that 304, or 88%, mentioned that they were very comfortable or comfortable with this approach. 79% said that they would come in if they were flagged, which is always an interesting statistic because Sherman will tell you what our actual uptake percentage is, and I can tell you I would love it to be 79%, but it isn't. 85% reported that they felt positive about this kind of outreach. So that, again, the privacy piece and how it's communicated to students, I think, is a really key consideration in developing this programming.
So we wanted to share our outcomes so far. If you heard the introduction, you know my background's in assessment, so this, of course, was going to be a part of our presentation. So fortunately, we do have at least, I guess, one year and one term of data. So like we mentioned early on, in 2016 is when it was rolled out campus-wide. So we are comparing our data from last year to this year. So we're not able to look at a lot of the long-term stats that we want to, such as retention, improved GPA, things like that. But we are looking right now at kind of the uptake, what the case statuses are. So how it works right now is when we identify a student and the individual academic development specialist emails the student, they are tasked with updating the case status of each student. So there's many different case statuses that can be chosen. One is appointment scheduled. After they attend the appointments, it's modified. And then there's many other choices, including no response. So if we get no response to our emails. And then how I grouped it this year was grouping a few different case statuses together into responded in some other capacity. So the reason that I wanted to do this is I wanted to share a couple stories about some of the students that have come in so far to provide a little bit more context on some of the aspects that we find of students coming in, but also to share why we wanted to recognize that students responding in some other capacity, for me, is as valuable to keep track of than the students that come in and the students that don't respond. So historically, there's been a lot of, at least from the beginning, there's been emails from students being like, oh, okay, I'm really happy you emailed me. I want to come in. I don't know what's going on. I don't know what help looks like, but I'm happy to come see you. Generally speaking, a lot of first-year students feel like this is a great opportunity for them, so they'll come in, and then we can provide them some additional context in terms of the transition and maybe some supports on campus that would help. But something that really surprised me, I think, coming into the role was the amount of students that are upper year levels that are struggling, mainly because of motivation. So they're getting into their program, they like what they're doing, but they're just struggling with going to class. They're experiencing the burnout. And I would say the number one, and we'll actually show you, the majority of our cases that we end up referring are to mental health services because we find a lot of our students are coming to us with anxiety. And some of them, obviously, we know the students that are having a difficult time attending class might not want to come see us, but fortunately we've had many students that say, yeah, I'm not going to class, but I wanted to come talk to you about this. Something that I've seen as a trend this past semester has been a lot of family pressure, a lot of family, I think, commitments that are required. So there's one student in specific that as soon as I sent the email, within a day, she responded saying, thank you so much for this, I really need to come talk to someone. And throughout the whole, I've met with her several times. Every meeting, she's always like, I'm so happy that you identified me because I didn't even know this existed, or I wouldn't have come in willingly. I didn't realize that I needed to. But what she's found is she's in her third year, she's struggling. She's kind of gotten by the first 2 years, but now her brother's also attending University of Calgary, and she's finding that her behaviors are being picked up by him. So the sleeping in and missing class, or the last-minute cramming, she's finding that what she does, he does, and he adopts. And so she actually took it upon herself to say, you know what, yes, I need to change my behaviors, and now she's kind of become a role model to him. She's encouraged him to come in and actually come see us. She's become a lot more of an advocate, not only for her brother, but also for herself and improving what she's doing academically. One student that came in was near tears when she left, and she was dealing with some family struggles, and she just said, she's like, you're the only person I've talked to about this. And the reason that student was identified was one of her faculty members identified on the faculty concern form that this is a student you probably want to reach out to. So it's really one of the huge benefits I've seen is that we're creating this campus where recognizing that students need support is not is not a stigma. It's a let's find the student support however they need it. And we're kind of the opportunity for students to come to see us, quote unquote, academically, but be connected with the resources that they really need that tend to do more with personal struggles. Many of the students that I've seen this semester are just in the wrong program. And so when they're in the wrong program, they're just finding their courses aren't working well for them. Several mature students have come back in terms of saying that now university is just a very different environment than what it was 10 years ago. So a lot of the conversations we're having, a lot of the stories that are coming up, I think we try to group them in specific categories, but it's hard to capture some of those independent stories. But once you meet with these students, you recognize the value of this program. And that's something I think we're trying to capture in our outcomes. Is it's not necessarily about the numbers, it's about the students that are seeking that behavior and getting that behavior. Overall, though, we're getting a lot of thank you emails. Thank you, but I don't need your help right now. Thank you, but I'm already seeing a counselor. Thank you, but I'm getting faculty support. And that's a lot of the responded in some other capacity. So when we look at our changes from 2016 to 2017, there is a slight decline in students that have attended or scheduled an appointment, which Roxanne is not necessarily the most happy about. But we also are still in contact with several of our students, about 18%. So we want to make sure that these numbers might be updated. So as I mentioned, the responded in some other capacity. What does that include? So these are the 6 areas that we've included. So from fall 2016 to 2017, there hasn't been a huge shift in numbers per se, but there has been in behaviors. So more students are emailing to say, yes, I'm interested, but I don't want to come in right now. Less students are either not coming for appointments or canceling their appointments. And more students are declining support but indicating why and saying, thank you for this offer, I will take you up on it if I need to. And part of the reason I want to start collecting this behavior is this can be a comparison group for us, comparing students that have attended sessions compared to these students who think they are doing okay or recognized initially that maybe I need help, but then didn't necessarily seek it out. So this is, as I mentioned, the individual stories. We're really trying to grasp what are the areas that students are actually struggling with, and since we invite them in for academic skills and strategies, that tends to be the #1 reason that students are coming in. A lot of it also has to do with, generally speaking, personal health, family issues, course content, academic performance. Time management is one I think that we've always seen as really common, and transition difficulties is another big one, as we mentioned earlier. So where do we refer them? So obviously a lot of these are going to be for ongoing ADS support, and ADS is the Academic Development Specialist. We also in the Student Success Center have tutoring as well, which is why tutoring is very high referral as well. But generally speaking, the most, I would say, outside of the Student Success Center, the Wellness Center is where we refer the majority of our students to. At the UC, wellness includes the doctors, chiropractors, as well as mental health services. So that's something we found works really well, is to say, why don't we take you over to a wellness center rather than to say, let's go take you to a counselor. Sometimes that conversation is a little bit easier to segue into. One thing that we've really been actively working on this semester is engaging our faculty in the conversations. So really quickly, I just want to show you the concern forms from fall of last year were 8. This year already we're at 17, and that was 10 days ago. We've done 12 faculty presentations, which are about 15 minutes to half an hour, and we share the program and share how we're there to support faculty, which we can see there has been a huge direct I think contribution to how many faculty are filling out the concern form, but also with the direct referrals. This I filled out on Tuesday, and I would say between yesterday and today I've already had an extra 3. So we're getting up there in terms of those direct referrals, which we also appreciate. Sometimes it's a lot easier for faculty to say, look, let me connect you directly with Shermin, who's an academic development specialist, rather than saying this might be an early alert case, because early alert is a lot more specific of what we're looking for. Generally speaking, as we mentioned, faculty like having one place that they can send students to. They like having someone to talk to about general issues, which often bleed into mental health concerns and the student at risk team that we offer here. But they really appreciate the online form that's super easy for them to complete, and the fact that someone is going to follow up on that information. So for our next steps, some of the things, as I've kind of alluded to, we're trying to figure out how we define success of the program. So uptake rate is important to us, but obviously if students aren't coming in, that's not saying our program isn't successful. So we're trying to look at other factors that might contribute to that. As Roxanne mentioned initially, how it started is we did want to create a form that, yes, encompassed the academic behaviors, but also included some of the mental health, financial health questions, which we haven't been able to. So we're going to continue to explore if that's possible. And also continue to refine the algorithm to correctly identify these at-risk students. So the algorithm we have right now has been working, but we also want to make sure that we're constantly staying up to date and modifying that as needed. And as I alluded to at the beginning, Roxanne and I constantly talk about predictive modeling and the role that it potentially can play in this. Do we want to start adding demographic factors or students factors that may contribute to them being at risk before they even get here into our model? And if so, how do we do that in an ethical manner? So I put debate in there intentionally because I think this is a challenge in Canada to have this conversation, and we're going to keep exploring it. I don't think there's an easy answer there.
Okay, and just sort of broadly, I think some of the research areas that we want to look at are, does flagging alone have an impact? So we send students 2 emails. We send the first email. If there's no response, we send a second email which has a list of resources. We'd like to start tracking whether or not students open those resources or access those, and see if students who are flagged versus students who are not flagged, if there's any difference there in terms of retention and success. Who we are and aren't reaching. So we know that our arts students, that's the highest population of students, and the faculty with the highest population of students is arts, but that tends to be, out of our 25-26% uptake, that tends to be the largest group, followed by science, which is the second largest faculty. But, are there students in faculties that we're not really reaching or that are not coming to us? We are tracking presenting concerns to ensure that we are reaching students at the right moment, and we do also connect with students by survey to try to collect some qualitative feedback after the fact to find out if this was the right moment for students, and kind of get a sense of their stories and their experience after using the academic services. Again, that sort of follows up with how Thrive impacts students. And we're always looking for improvement. One flaw or challenge with our system is that it operates on D2L, as Shermin said, so we need faculty using the gradebook. We need faculty putting grade information in a timely fashion. And we also really want to increase their awareness of the concern form and their use of the concern form. So these are all kind of larger program questions that we are tracking and exploring moving forward. We're going to just finish up. We've got a couple minutes before we stop for questions. I just wanted to go through, hopefully this could be potentially a bit of a resource for you. So we have some questions that we sort of asked ourselves when we were developing our own program that might be handy for you to think about as well. So if you were in that development stage. So what are your financial human resources? So for us, we have these very specialized roles called an academic development specialist, and at the Student Success Center, although there are many, many other services and we're constantly referring, we often sort of serve this first stop shop for students. So students will come here with many different questions, and we need to all be referral experts on campus. So this was a very we were in a situation where we had a role that served as a specialist but also a generalist, and so that was really our human resources. Financially, I mentioned that we did get a grant to begin, and then we're focused on financing the program more centrally now. Allies and champions. So we were very, very lucky to have a key supporter in IT. It was a perfect storm. They had just come from an institution where they had put forward an early alert program, and they were really, really interested and helped us push forward and get the resources that we needed. We also had our VP student experience, who was really on board with us and helped us push the program forward. Thinking about your size, our colleague at Mount Royal, who is running an early alert program, is working solely with faculty feedback, and that's working really, really well. But they have small class sizes of about 30 students each. That doesn't really work in our context, but I mean, really, the program you design depends on the size and what the teaching and assessment practices are like. Also kind of looking at institutional strategy documents and how you can kind of leverage some of those key goals of your institution to connect them into early alert. So ours was retention and recruitment, so we were easily able to kind of fit the early alert plan and get it into our comprehensive institutional plan in terms of retention, student retention. Thinking about, again, human resources, so who's best placed, what's your referral network? So who you have, kind of thinking in advance, we had to think about what are we going to see students with, and do we have good connections and good referral practices to make sure that students, when we send them somewhere, they're going to be able to get help. And we can do what we call warm referrals, right? I can refer someone over to Jeff in wellness, who may be a counselor, is a much warmer strategy than just saying, oh, well, go use this service. So thinking about how we manage those referrals was really key, and making sure that we had all of those resources set up in place before we started to actually use the program. Again, some institutions have a much less centralized approach to student support, so that I think is a key consideration in terms of how you develop early alert and whether you're doing it at a smaller scale or a larger scale. And lastly, just communicating and evaluating. These were built into our plans right from the beginning and are really key factors. If we build it but nobody comes, then it will be really challenging to kind of continue forward. And especially, I mean, we really did a lot of piloting stages to make sure that we had some good success and some good modeling before we went campus-wide. And that helped us to access resources from our IT, for instance, and to enable us to get some of that support moving forward. Okay, now we'll just turn it over to some questions.
All right, thank you so much for your presentation. That was really comprehensive. I'm just going to turn my webcam back on, and if you both could do the same.
Right.
Okay, so we have a whole bunch of questions rolling in. We might not be able to get to all of them, but the first question is, how do you track attendance in large classes? So we're looking at upwards of 1,000 students.
So that is one of our challenges right now. Unfortunately, we haven't figured out a way to do so. I think faculty, some of our presentations have also recognized that that would be a great way, but it's very difficult right now, so we haven't found the answer. If you have a suggestion, please let us know, because we're constantly trying to problem solve that one, and that one is a very difficult one, I think, to approach.
I think one possible avenue to explore is looking at tracking attendance in the labs and tutorials of large classes. So typically those larger classes have a smaller setting where students are learning, and there's a teaching assistant involved that maybe could enter in attendance data. So in D2L we don't track attendance, faculty generally don't, but I think that that is an opportunity in a smaller setting like a lab or tutorial where that could be explored.
Yep. Next question, what is the background education of the academic development specialists? Are they social workers? What's their training?
That's a great question. So it's a bit eclectic, and eclectic by strategy and design, I think. So we definitely have folks like Shermin who have higher ed background in terms of their research background, and also Shermin comes to us with some health promotion experience in terms of launching programming. We have a lot of people that come from teaching, so who have taught as instructors or faculty here at the institution and have that skill set. We also have people who are kind of learning strategists. We do have some counseling background on staff, but that's not the focus of many of our roles. And I think it's because we have a really strong counseling team here at University of Calgary, and we do a lot of cross referral. So we might work with a student on academic issues, and then we would they would work also with the counselor simultaneously on some, or a social work. We have a big social work team that does a case management team over in wellness. They would work with those professionals, and we would kind of work in tandem.
As a general rule, each academic development specialist has to at least have a master's degree, so they must have some graduate study experience in their discipline.
Thank you. The next question is, speaking of staff, have you encountered any faculty, staff pushing back on wanting to be involved in the program, such as believing that the student needs to self-advocate for support, those sorts of things?
Absolutely. We were really lucky, I think, to have both our vice provost student experience, the support of that individual, as well as the support of the provost, and as I said, kind of writing these programs into comprehensive institutional plans and institutional documents helps to create and garner some of that support. I think storytelling is a really key practice that can help faculty understand some of sometimes faculty just don't interact with students in the way that we do. They don't see the challenges and struggles that a student might have, and they don't realize how hard it might be to reach out in that moment. And so I think we do a lot of storytelling to let them know, that sometimes there's a moment where you actually need some help, seeking help. But we have had a bit of that pushback for sure. We do have an option. It's possible that a faculty member could opt out. So within the D2L gradebook, we built that in just, in case somebody really felt strongly that it wasn't going to work for them or they didn't want their data accessed. I think since we started, we've probably had maybe a handful of people do that. And getting out to the department meetings. So Shermin mentioned we've been going to faculty meetings, so we've been really going to department level meetings to explain the program. A lot of times faculty are actually, it's really hard for them to navigate resources, so it's really hard for them to always do referral. So they're often appreciative of the fact that there's some centralized opportunity to help connect students with resources and that they don't have to track all of those resources.
Thank you. The next question is, does the University of Calgary offer courses or surveys in mental health literacy and awareness of, say, like emotional well-being, language, and are drugs a factor, either therapeutic or recreational, at your university?
We do the National College Health Assessment. We've done it a couple times now, and if you're not familiar with the National College Health Assessment, it's a tool that collects data on students' attitudes, behaviors, perceptions about many health and wellness topics, including mental health. One of the additions that Alberta and Canada have done to the National College Health Assessment is to add a little bit more about flourishing versus languishing in terms of mental health. So that data is available. I would say when it comes to the drug use, I don't think we've done specific analysis about the interaction of the drug use with mental health statistics.
Maybe just to add that we do have a campus-wide mental health strategy that is something that is accessible off the website. So we have done, and we have a lot of subcommittees. I'm involved in a couple of those subcommittees. One of them outreaching to faculty and looking at creating an embedded certificate for mental health, which they're just in the process of working through learning outcomes. So there really is quite a large focus on mental health initiatives across campus, I think at all institutions, and we work with a province-wide group as well. So I would encourage people to kind of look at the mental health strategy. It has some very specific outcomes that are tracked annually. In terms of the data, I would agree with Shermin that I'm not sure, and I think our mental health professionals would probably know better about things like drugs and addictions. I know we certainly do have programming to address those concerns, and it's part of the overall mental health strategy, but I don't know exactly what the data is on that.
Thank you. I think we only have time for maybe 2 more questions, so very quickly. Do you have any visions or discussions of extending this early alert system or the software to your HR department to identify at-risk employees to enhance campus mental health from a broader perspective?
Okay, that's a really interesting question. We have not actually come across that. I think so because we are focused quite exclusively on academics, Shermin mentioned that, there was originally, and there is some hope to have a vision for mental health tracking and some of those kind of concerning behaviors. That is not a direction that we're going in at the moment. We do have a student at risk committee, which again, focuses on students, but for students with behavior, maybe harm to self or others, very, very concerning behavior. And so they receive reports, and that's a multidisciplinary team that works on addressing those concerns. So I should mention that the mental health strategy does include faculty and staff. It's for everybody. So there are quite a lot of initiatives that are going on for mental health. We have a You Flourish Week where there's a number of events that faculty and staff can be part of. So there is a big focus on supporting faculty and staff as well. But there hasn't been any interest, and I don't know that we would be the people if there was, in terms of identifying staff or faculty.
Thank you. All right, last question, and I do apologize to everyone who we weren't able to get to. There's just been a lot of interest in this. What are the privacy issues related to developing predictive models for students at risk? And I guess this is related to, you're looking at so many different facets like their academic performance and things like that. So what are the issues there?
Roxanne looks at me because this is kind of my baby. So there's a lot of predictive modeling done in the US right now, but the US also has access to a lot of information. So as a student that went to an American institution, once I went and signed my, whatever it was, student form, every single data point they wanted, they had on me. So they tracked whatever I did, any services I accessed. So for them to be able to add in those factors, it's really easy. And I think that's where the mentality is. For us in Canada, we don't collect that data as easily. So it's a lot more difficult, I think, to ingrain certain data points. Some of the things that I think would play a role in predictive modeling are things like gender, age, ethnicity, things like that that aren't always collected. So yes, we know gender, yes, we likely know year of birth, but adding in things like, is a student Indigenous? Is a student of, are they a people of color? Like those kind of factors I think are the ethical piece of what our conversation is should we be identifying students on those factors? So we recognize that they are a factor and make students more at risk, but can we make that as part of the equation, but justify it to students in a way that they understand that we do have the best intentions? And I think that's constantly a struggle we're having, I think, at the national level as well, of just about how do we add predictive modeling to the idea of proactive advising, just because we can't say we're identifying students based on who they were or what they happen to look like or their age.
And I think there's the privacy consideration. So right now we sort of land under the Post-Secondary Act, and the way that our privacy officers work with us is really mandate focused. So what do we already have access to? What are we mandated to do? And do we need that information? So I think we haven't entered into that territory. I think we would have a lot different kinds of privacy conversations if we were to, and there would be a lot of things to consider. So I think in general, thinking about what your specific mandate is as a unit and what information you can collect in terms of student success, I think is probably the best place to start, rather than branching out to, like as I mentioned, we started with a very wide net and we gradually kind of moved into a smaller and smaller lane. But that doesn't mean that the students that we are seeing don't have a lot of those other concerns, right? And so you can kind of access identifying students with a particular focus and then help them, refer them to other areas. So it can have a broader outcome and a broader approach.
And just recognizing that we didn't answer everyone's questions, we apologize. I think both Roxanne and I get really excited and talk quite a bit. Feel free to email either of us. We have our email information on the last slide, so we're happy to respond to your question. We just apologize for not having time to do so now.
Thank you so much, both of you. The last question was a really tricky question, and thank you for your response. Very well thought out. So thank you, and thank you everyone for joining us today. Last thing I'm going to do is I'm just going to direct you to our website at campusmentalhealth.ca, where you can find a lot of the other resources that we have in PSC Mental Health, and also all of the recordings for our past webinars. You can also sign up for our mailing list that we use to distribute the monthly newsletter, which is going to contain basically announcements for all the future webinars that are happening. Our next webinar is in January, and it's on building strengths-based resilience in students. So stay tuned for that in the newsletter, and don't forget our survey that's going to pop up at the end of the webinar. Thank you, Shermin. Thank you, Roxanne, and thank you everyone for attending.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.